After the Vietnam video went up, the messages started coming in. Most of them were what you expect, people sharing things they had read, questions about specific operations, the usual. But one of them stopped me. A viewer reached out and told me about his family. His great-grandfather had two brothers. One of them had served in the Waffen-SS during the Second World War, survived the entire thing, and after the war had ended up in the Congo in the early 1960s as a mercenary. He had fought there, he had been involved in the kind of operations this video is going to describe, and then he had come home, and the family had never really spoken about it publicly, and it had stayed inside the household as one of those stories that gets passed down quietly to the people who need to know it and kept away from everyone else. I found that interesting for the same reason the Vietnam story was interesting. Not because it was shocking, though it is, but because it tells you something about the scale of what actually happened that the official history does not capture. When the French Foreign Legion was recruiting from German prisoner of war camps in 1945 and 1946, they were drawing from a pool of men that historians can approximately count. 50,000 Germans cycled through Indochina over the 9 years of that war. The numbers are large enough to be documented, even if the individual identities were hidden behind the Legion's anonymate policy. The Congo is different. There was no anonymate. There was no institutional structure keeping records that historians could eventually access. The men who went to the Congo as mercenaries in 1964 went as individuals, recruited through newspaper advertisements, paid in cash, operating under whatever names they chose, and most of them left no paper trail that anyone was subsequently interested in following. The documented cases, the ones we can name, are the ones who became famous or notorious enough that journalists and filmmakers tracked them down. The man this video is primarily about became notorious enough that East German propagandists flew to South Africa specifically to interview him. Most of the other German veterans who were in the Congo with him did not attract that kind of attention. They did their work, they went home, and they stayed in families as private stories. I think there were far more of them than most people realise. I think the viewer who messaged me about his family is one of many people sitting on the same kind of account. And I think the reason those accounts stayed private is the same reason the men themselves never talked. It is an extremely complicated thing to explain that you served in the Waffen-SS, were rejected by the West German army, answered a newspaper advertisement, flew to Central Africa, and spent a year fighting a communist insurgency while wearing your 1945 Iron Cross in a tropical jungle. This is that story. It starts in 1960 in a country that had just been handed independence it was not prepared for, and it ends with a German man dying quietly in a Johannesburg suburb in 1983, the same man who had grinned at a Time magazine photographer in the Congolese jungle with a swastika engraved medal on his chest. Everything between those 2 points is one of the most extraordinary and least understood chapters of the Cold War. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, known in 1960 simply as the Republic of the Congo, gained independence from Belgium on June 30th, 1960, after 80 years of colonial rule that had been, by the assessment of most historians who have examined it, among the most brutal in the history of European colonialism. King Leopold II of Belgium had run the Congo Free State as his personal property from 1885 to 1908, extracting rubber and ivory through a system of forced labour enforced by the threat of mutilation and death. The Belgian government had taken formal colonial control after Leopold's methods attracted international condemnation, but the administrative model, extraction of resources by a European apparatus that systematically excluded Congolese people from positions of authority, education or participation in the country's economy beyond manual labour, continued until the final days. When independence came in June 1960, the Congo had a population of approximately 14 million people across a territory the size of Western Europe, and the Belgian government had produced, through its education policies, precisely 16 Congolese university graduates in the entire country. There was not a single Congolese officer in the army, not a single Congolese doctor in independent practice, not a single Congolese engineer with formal qualifications. The country that was handed independence had been specifically, deliberately kept incapable of self-governance. The uranium for the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945 had come from the Congo's mines. The country held most of the world's cobalt reserves outside Soviet soil, cobalt being essential to the jet engine industry and therefore to every air force in the world. It had industrial diamonds, strategic copper, gold, and the largest tropical rainforest in Africa. Washington and Moscow both understood that the Congo was a piece of the Cold War that neither side could afford to lose. Patrice Lumumba was the Congo's first democratically elected prime minister. He was 34 years old, charismatic, a brilliant orator, and a man whose political instincts ran toward Pan-African nationalism and genuine independence from great power interference. When Belgian-backed forces in Katanga province, led by Moise Tshombe, a sophisticated westernized Congolese politician with extensive ties to Belgian mining interests, announced the secession of Katanga within 2 weeks of independence, Lumumba asked the United Nations for help and was told the UN peacekeeping force could not intervene in what Belgium and the West characterized as an internal political matter. He then asked the Soviet Union for assistance. This was the moment that condemned him. The CIA station chief in Leopoldville sent a cable to Washington recommending his elimination. President Eisenhower, in a National Security Council meeting on August 18, 1960, is recorded, depending on the interpretation of the minutes, as having either directly ordered or strongly implied the desirability of Lumumba's assassination. By September 1960, Lumumba had been ousted in a coup by his own army chief, Joseph Mobutu, with CIA support. In January 1961, he was transferred to Katanga and handed to Tshombe's forces. He was beaten, tortured and shot on January 17, 1961. His body was dissolved in sulfuric acid by a Belgian police officer named Gerard Souete, who kept the teeth as trophies. Souete displayed the teeth on Belgian television in 2000. What followed Lumumba's murder was the specific kind of chaos that the systematic destruction of a country's capacity for self-governance produces. Political factions fought over the remnants of power. The UN peacekeeping force intervened selectively, generally in ways that favoured Western interests. Tshombe's Katanga secession was eventually ended in 1963 after UN forces intervened directly, but the rage that Lumumba's murder had produced among his followers did not end with the political settlement. By 1963, armed rebellion had broken out across the eastern Congo. The rebels called themselves Simbas, the Kiswahili word for lion, and they were fighting in the name of Lumumba's legacy, loosely inspired by a combination of Lumumbism and Maoism, backed with weapons and training from the Soviet Union, China, and Cuba. They were also, in a dimension of the conflict that Western reporting consistently underrepresented, a movement shaped by the specific spiritual traditions of the communities they came from. The Simbas believed that ritual protection made them invulnerable to bullets. This was not a metaphor and it was not propaganda. It was the sincere conviction of the young men who joined the movement, reinforced by the specific practices of initiation they underwent. Witch doctors, Dawa practitioners, moved at the heads of Simba columns. Recruits were initiated with ceremonies involving hemp and ritual incantation, and told that, by following a moral code, avoiding women before battle, following specific prohibitions, they could not be killed by enemy fire. The belief was so total and so effective at producing fearlessness in the men who held it that it became a genuine tactical factor. When a government army column encountered a Simba unit whose vanguard consisted of bare-chested men chanting while a witch doctor swept the road ahead of them with palm branches, the government soldiers broke. Not sometimes. Consistently. In August 1964, a single bare-chested witch doctor walked up the main street of Stanleyville, a city of 150,000 people with a government garrison of 1,500 soldiers, chanting and waving palm branches, and the entire garrison fled without firing a shot. The city fell. The Simbas proclaimed the People's Republic of the Congo with Stanleyville as its capital. Within hours they had begun rounding up the westernized Congolese middle class, the Evolués, the evolved ones, the people who had ties to European education or the colonial administration, and executing them in the central square. Moise Tshombe, whose relationship with the West had survived the Katanga secession and who was now Prime Minister of the central government, faced a rebellion that controlled a third of the country, was receiving Soviet, Chinese and Cuban material support, and was defeating the Congolese army on every front. The United Nations, which had deployed 20,000 peacekeepers to the Congo from 1960 to 1964, was in the process of withdrawing. The Organization of African Unity opposed Western military intervention as neo-colonialist. The Congolese army was unreliable, undertrained, and prone to the same superstitious terror of the Simba Dawa rituals that afflicted civilian populations. Tshombe needed soldiers who would not run from witch doctors. He needed men who had been to worse places than a jungle where people believed in magic bullets. and who had learned in those places that a man who runs from a man who believes he cannot be killed is the one who dies. He placed advertisements in South African and Rhodesian newspapers, calling upon physically fit white men fond of combat. He placed similar advertisements in European papers. The response was immediate. 500 men volunteered within weeks. The majority were South Africans and Rhodesians, former British colonial soldiers, veterans of the Korean War and the Malayan Emergency and various African conflicts, but a significant proportion were Europeans, and among the Europeans, Germans, men who had fought in the Wehrmacht, men who had served in the Waffen-SS, men who arrived in Leopoldville wearing their Second World War decorations, iron crosses visible, the swastika at the centre of the medal catching the equatorial sun. Mike Hoare, the Irish-born British Army major turned South African safari operator who agreed to command the force, designated 5 Commando of the Armée Nationale Congolaise, described his force in his memoir as a ragbag of misfits on whom he imposed stern discipline. He was not wrong about the ragbag quality. 19 different nationalities were represented in 5 Commando over the course of its operations. There was Maurice Lucien Brun, a former French cavalryman who sailed his 38-foot ketch from France to South Africa to sign up and who, according to Hoare, spoke English like Charles Boyer. There were Belgians who had lost property and relatives in the Congo's independence and who had personal scores to settle. There were British veterans of various colonial campaigns. There were Rhodesians who brought the specific quality of bushfighters who had been operating in African terrain for years. And there were the Germans, whom Hoare described specifically in his published account as mostly Second World War veterans who had arrived wearing iron crosses. The plural, the specifically plural, is what matters. Not one German with an iron cross. Multiple Germans, multiple iron crosses. Hoare noticed them because one of them became a problem he had to manage publicly. What brought these German veterans to Tshombe's advertisement, rather than to quiet lives in the Federal Republic, is not a single story. It is several stories with overlapping themes, and understanding those themes requires understanding what it meant to be a German combat veteran in the decade and a half between the end of the war and the beginning of the Congo Crisis. Germany in 1945 was rubble, not metaphorically, literally. Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, Berlin. Each of them was a moonscape of collapsed buildings and uncleared bodies, a landscape where the infrastructure of normal life had been destroyed so thoroughly that the question of simple survival, food, shelter, warmth, occupied every waking hour for millions of people. The eastern provinces had been absorbed into Poland and the Soviet Union. The men, returning from prisoner of war camps, returned to find their homes gone, their families scattered or dead, their cities unrecognizable. They were the survivors of a total war that their country had started and lost, and the country they returned to had no particular interest in their experiences and significant institutional reasons to discourage discussion of them. The new West German state was constructing a version of the recent past that emphasized collective victimhood, economic recovery, and democratic transformation. The specific experiences of men who had served in the Waffen-SS or the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front did not fit this narrative and were systematically marginalized from it. The Bundeswehr, the new West German army established in 1955, screened its recruits carefully. Men with certain service histories, senior SS ranks, documented war crimes, specific unit affiliations were rejected. This screening was imperfect and inconsistent, and significant numbers of former Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS officers did eventually serve in the Bundeswehr. But the screening process, even in its imperfect form, filtered out enough veterans to create a category of men who found themselves unable to practice the only professional skill they had developed in the previous 6 years. These men were soldiers. They had been soldiers since their late teens in many cases. They had served through campaigns that tested every capability a soldier can possess and had survived, which meant they were not merely experienced but specifically self-selected by the war's attrition for the qualities that kept men alive under sustained combat pressure. And the one institution in their country that could have employed those qualities had told them they were not suitable. Some of them went to North Africa. There was consistent work available clearing ordnance from the Second World War's desert campaigns. The Afrika Korps and the British 8th Army had left enormous quantities of mines, unexploded bombs and ammunition across Libya and Egypt, and the post-independence governments of those countries were willing to pay European veterans to clear them. It was hazardous, unglamorous, and specifically suited to men who had technical military training and no particular attachment to their personal safety. British Petroleum employed Germans in this capacity. One of the men who took this route was Siegfried Müller, who spent several years in North Africa clearing German mines laid by the same army he had fought in for a British oil company before emigrating to South Africa and eventually answering Tshombe's advertisement. Some went to the French Foreign Legion, as this channel's video about the Vietnam War described in detail. 50,000 of them went to Indochina across the 9 years of that conflict and died in jungle ambushes and limestone gorges at places like the Coxar Gorge on Route Colonial 4, buried under false names the Legion had given them at enlistment in Algeria. The Legion asked what a man could do, not what he had been. For men who had been told in Germany that what they had been disqualified them from what they wanted to do, this was a significant offer. And some went to Africa, not as legionnaires but as freelancers, as mercenaries in the specific sense that the word carries, men who contracted their military skills to whoever would pay for them in conflicts that the formal structures of the Cold War had not yet organised into proxy armies with clear command structures and regular payrolls. The Congo in 1964 was exactly this kind of conflict. It was messy, it was urgent, it had money behind it, from the CIA and from the Belgian mining interests that had been operating in Katanga, and it was looking for men who knew how to fight and were willing to do it in a place where the rules were unclear and the oversight was minimal. Siegfried Friedrich Heinrich Müller was born on October 26, 1920, in Krossen an der Oder, now Krosno-Odrzański in Poland, on the wrong side of the Oder-Neisse line that post-war territorial adjustments drew through the middle of lands that had been German for generations. His family was Prussian in the specific sense that the word carried more than geographical meaning, conservative, military, shaped by the Junker tradition of service to state and fatherland that had produced German officers since before the unification of 1871. His father served in the First World War, and then again as a lieutenant colonel in the Wehrmacht. Siegfried was enrolled at a boarding school in Freiburg, and joined the Jungvolk, the junior section of the Hitler Youth Organization, reaching the rank of Fähnleinführer, a junior leadership position in the movement's structure. He graduated from the boarding school in 1938 at 17 and entered the National Labour Service before joining the Wehrmacht in 1939. He fought in Poland, France, and on the Eastern Front. He claims, and this claim is unverified in surviving records, to have reached the rank of first lieutenant by the war's end. What is documented is that he was seriously wounded on the Eastern Front in 1945 and was captured by American forces. He served as a conscript labourer in the US Army's Civilian Labour Group until 1947, then moved into the CLG security services and was given the rank of lieutenant, a rank he held in an American-administered German labour organisation rather than in the German army, which tells you something about the specific bureaucratic texture of the post-war years. He applied to the Bundeswehr in 1956 and was rejected. The screening process that was rejecting men with certain service histories caught him. What specifically in his record triggered the rejection is not in the available documentation. The Bundeswehr's rejection records are not publicly accessible. What followed the rejection is, he travelled to North Africa and spent several years working for British Petroleum, clearing German mines from the Sahara Desert. This is the detail in Müller's biography that I keep returning to, because it captures the specific absurdity of what the war produced in the men who survived it. He had fought for Germany across 6 years in several countries, he had been wounded fighting for Germany, he had been rejected by Germany's new army, and then he spent his early middle age in a desert, clearing mines laid by Germany for a British oil company. The mines he was clearing had been placed by men who had been fighting on the same side as the army he had served in a campaign he may well have followed as it happened. He was clearing up after himself, in the most indirect possible sense. He emigrated to South Africa in 1962 and worked as a hotel executive. When Tshombe's advertisement appeared, he read it and he answered it. He arrived at the assembly point at Kamina Air Base in the Congo's Katanga province in the summer of 1964 and was designated a lieutenant, the same rank he had been given by the Americans in the Civilian Labour Group. He was 43 years old, At 43, he was the oldest soldier in Mike Hoare's force, which skewed considerably younger. He was also, very quickly, not an anonymous participant. He wore his 1945 Iron Cross on his uniform in the Congo. The Iron Cross First Class that he had received for his Eastern Front service was a Nazi-era decoration. The specific design, issued from 1939 onward, featured a swastika at the centre of the cross, the same swastika that had been the emblem of the state that had lost the war and been categorically condemned by both German successor states and the international community. In a South African or Rhodesian context, among men who had fought in British colonial armies and whose political views covered a wide range, this was perhaps an eccentricity. When journalists from Time magazine and Der Spiegel arrived to cover the mercenary operations in the Congo and photographed Müller grinning at the camera with the swastika medal visible on his chest, it became something significantly larger than an eccentricity. He was promoted to captain after leading the successful seizure of Albertville, now Calamy, in July 1964, one of the first major mercenary operations of the campaign. He was given command of Commando 52, a sub-unit of 5 commando comprising approximately 53 soldiers, drawn primarily from German and French veterans. The specifically German character of his unit was noted by multiple observers at the time. These were men who had served in the Wehrmacht and in some cases in the Waffen-SS, men who had fought across the European theatre of the Second World War and had washed up in southern Africa in the late 1950s and early 1960s through the various routes available to German veterans who could not find a place in the Federal Republic's carefully constructed post-war identity. Some of them had answers when journalists asked what had brought them to the Congo that mirrored Müller's own account. There was nothing left in Germany, the army wouldn't have them, the work was what they knew how to do. The operations that Commando 52 conducted in the second half of 1964 were the standard elements of the broader 5 Commando campaign against the Simba rebellion. They ran hit-and-run raids east of Boenda. They liberated white missionary stations and farms that had been occupied by Simba forces, typically encountering the specific terror that the mercenaries' appearance produced among fighters who had been told by witch doctors that white men's bullets had no power over them, and then discovered empirically that this information was incorrect. The pattern was consistent. Simba forces who maintained the ritual invulnerability belief often stood and fought until the casualties became undeniable, at which point the belief collapsed with catastrophic rapidity and the formation dissolved. For the mercenaries advancing on these positions, the fighting was intense while it lasted and then suddenly over. The Simbas did not take prisoners. The mercenaries, after what they found when they entered positions that Simba forces had held, did not always take prisoners either. In late 1964, Müller's unit suffered a major morale and discipline crisis after its first assault on the town of Boenda failed. The town was defended more effectively than the advance intelligence had suggested, and the initial assault was driven back with casualties. Deserters from Commando 52 described Müller publicly as incompetent and too soft, the specific criticism of a commander who has led an unsuccessful assault, and whose authority is therefore immediately questioned by men who have no institutional loyalty to the formation they joined through a newspaper advertisement. The town was eventually captured in a second assault. By the time the broader 5 Commando force was advancing on Stanleyville in October and November 1964, Müller had been promoted to Major, and Commando 52 was functioning as a sub-unit of the larger operation moving toward the city. Stanleyville fell to the Simbas in August 1964, and what followed in the months before its liberation was what happens when a revolutionary movement whose violence has no systematic constraints occupies a city. The Simbas rounded up the westernized Congolese middle class, the people they identified as collaborators with the colonial order, and killed them in the central square. Estimates of Congolese deaths in Stanleyville during the Simba occupation range from 1,000 to 2,000. They then rounded up every Belgian and American in the city, diplomats, missionaries, business people, families, approximately 1,800 people in total, and held them hostage in the Victoria Hotel. On October 28th, they arrested all Belgians and Americans in the surrounding region and had them transported to the city. The hostages were the Simbas' bargaining chip against Western intervention. Kill them if the government forces advance. Radio Stanleyville broadcast instructions that all foreigners were to be considered prisoners of war and would be executed if the Congolese government and its allies attempted a military rescue. In Washington, the crisis produced a response that involved multiple agencies and a specific combination of overt and covert action that characterizes the CIA's involvement in the Congo throughout this period. The State Department had representatives in the city. Michael Hoyt, the principal officer of the US consulate, was among the hostages and would spend 111 days in Simba captivity before the rescue. The CIA's Africa division had been running operations in the Congo since the Lumumba period. Cuban exile pilots contracted by the CIA through a program designated WIGMO were flying T-28 strike aircraft and B-26 bombers in support of the Congolese government forces, attacking Simba positions with a deniability that the use of American military pilots would not have provided. The CIA station in Leopoldville was coordinating intelligence on Simba positions and dispositions for the benefit of Mike Hoare's 5 Commando. Washington and Brussels worked jointly on the rescue plan, with the American contribution being the transport aircraft and the Belgian contribution being the paratroopers. The operation was called Dragon Rouge, Red Dragon. On the morning of November 24, 1964, 5 American C-130 Hercules transport aircraft descended over Stanleyville's Sabina Airport at 700 feet. The aircraft were US Air Force planes flown by US Air Force crews, nominally civilian in documentation to provide the State Department with deniability but unmistakably military in their markings. One US Air Force crewman, Captain Max Accord, looked down through the windscreen at the jungle spreading to every horizon below and began his descent into a city he had never seen, executing a mission whose existence Washington was simultaneously denying. 350 Belgian paratroopers of the Paracommando Regiment were in the aircraft. They jumped. Within 45 minutes of the first man leaving the aircraft, the airfield was secure. Colonel Charles Laurent reported that the runway was clear. The paratroopers moved toward the Victoria Hotel, where the majority of the hostages were concentrated. At 6 o'clock in the morning, before the paratroopers reached them, Radio Stanleyville broadcast the order, "Kill all foreigners." The Simba guards at the hotel rounded up the hostages and marched them into the street. 60 people who had barricaded themselves in their rooms did not come down. The rest walked out into the morning air and were ordered to sit on the road. A few minutes later, when the sound of firefighting from the direction of the airport reached the Simba commanders, the order was given to open fire on the seated hostages. The Belgian paratroopers arrived as the shooting started. They killed and drove away the Simba fighters. They found 30 dead. Among them was Dr. Paul Carlson, an American medical missionary who had come to the Congo with his family a year earlier and had been held for weeks on accusations of being a CIA spy. He died in the street outside the Victoria Hotel within seconds of the paratroopers arriving, shot by men who had 30 more seconds of control before they lost it. He was 36 years old. Over the next 2 days, 1,800 Americans and Europeans were evacuated from Stanleyville by air. Around 400 Congolese civilians were also evacuated. Almost 200 foreigners and thousands of Congolese were executed by the Simbas before and during the operation. Mike Hoare's 5 Commando, ground forces approaching from the west in a column of over 200 vehicles, entered the city hours after the Belgian paratroopers, coordinating the ground seizure of the city once the airborne element had secured the airport and the immediate vicinity of the Victoria Hotel. What the mercenaries found when they entered the streets was not a pretty sight. A New Zealand missionary family, the father dead, the mother cut with machetes, the daughters with scalp wounds. American diplomat William Schaufel, who was the Congo desk officer in Washington at the time, described the operation afterward with the specific, careful language of a man who understood both what had been saved and what had been lost in the process. Most of the hostages had been rescued, some had not. The white mercenaries who came in and took control of the city did so with the specific anger that men who have just seen what Simba forces left behind them feel when they are no longer constrained by the presence of Belgian paratroopers operating under formal rules of engagement. The total Simba death toll in the days immediately following Dragon Rouge and the mercenary seizure of the city is not precisely documented. It was large. The Belgian paratroopers were under orders limiting their operations to the hostage rescue. The mercenaries were not. Schaufeler's diplomatic account notes that the mercenaries who entered the city showed the same lack of concern for the distinction between combatant and suspected combatant that the Simba forces themselves had displayed during the occupation. For the remainder of the afternoon after Dragon Rouge, as one contemporary account put it was open season in Stanleyville. Müller and the men of Commando 52 were part of this force. What they specifically did in Stanleyville beyond their operational role in the ground assault is documented only in ways that serve different agendas. The East German documentary that was made about Müller 2 years later drew on photographs that showed mercenaries posing with skulls and human remains, and presented this as evidence of systematic atrocity. Müller's own accounts, given to journalists and eventually to the East German filmmakers who tricked him into an interview, acknowledged things that he then attempted to walk back when he realised how they sounded on camera. The mercenaries were called Les Affreux by the Congolese, the Terrible Ones. The name was not given affectionately. After the fall of Stanleyville, the Simba Rebellion continued in reduced form for more than a year. There was one other dimension of the Congo Crisis that stands as one of the Cold War's most extraordinary ironies. On April 24, 1965, Ernesto Che Guevara, the Argentine revolutionary who had become the most recognizable face of the Cuban Revolution, a man whose image would become the defining icon of the 1960s global left, secretly entered the Congo from Tanzania, crossing Lake Tanganyika with a contingent of approximately 100 Afro-Cuban fighters. He was there to support the Simba Rebellion. He had been told by his Algerian friend Ahmed Ben Bella that the plan was unwise. He had been told by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser that he would become a Tarzan figure, doomed to failure. He went anyway. His goal was to train the Simbas in Marxist guerrilla tactics and use the Congo as a base for exporting revolution across southern Africa. He wanted to ignite Angola, Mozambique, Rhodesia and South Africa from a Congolese base camp. The CIA knew he was there. The National Security Agency was intercepting his communications from a floating listening post. The USNS Private Jose F. Valdez, a ship that cruised the Indian Ocean specifically to monitor communications from the Congolese theatre. After becoming aware of the Cuban presence in eastern Congo, Mike Hoare adjusted his operational planning to address Guevara's specific tactical contributions. The CIA's Cuban exile pilots flying WIGMO aircraft strafed rebel positions that Guevara's forces were defending. The ground offensive that the mercenaries drove, including Müller's German veterans in Commando 52, progressively cut off the Simba forces from their supply routes across Lake Tanganyika. Guevara spent 7 months in the Congo trying to impose military discipline on a force that believed ritual protection was superior to tactical training and whose leadership was riven by exactly the kind of internal political disputes that make effective military command impossible. He described the experience in his Congo diary with a bluntness that serves as both honest self-criticism and devastating indictment of the forces he was trying to lead. In late June 1965, Kabila ordered a Cuban Simba-Rwandan attack on the ANC garrison at Bendera. Guevara opposed the operation as premature. The attack was launched anyway. It failed completely. The Rwandans fled at the first contact with enemy fire. Guevara wrote, "This is the history of a failure." He withdrew in November 1965 and crossed back into Tanzania, ending one of the most quixotic military expeditions of the Cold War. He had been defeated, in the tactical sense, by a combination of the CYA's resources, the Belgian paratroopers' professional quality, and a force of mercenaries that included former Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS veterans who were wearing their 1945 Iron Crosses in the equatorial heat. The most famous revolutionary of the 20th century had his most comprehensive military failure at the hands of, among others, men who had been soldiers for the country that built Auschwitz. History does not always produce its ironies cleanly. The publicity that surrounded the mercenary operations in the Congo reached West Germany with particular force because of the photographs. Müller's Iron Cross, visible in every image, made him instantly recognizable as a specific kind of figure, not just a mercenary, but a specifically German mercenary, specifically a veteran of the Nazi military, specifically a man who wore the emblem of the defeated regime in a former African colony, with the demeanor of a man who saw nothing wrong with any of it. The left-leaning magazine Concrete published a piece in December 1964 called Congo Atrocity, that was the first major West German exposure to Müller's activities. Student activists and socialist organizations seized on him as a symbol of everything they were arguing about West German society: the unreconstructed Nazis, the colonial violence, the comfortable continuity between what the Reich had been and what the Federal Republic pretended not to be. The East German state, which operated an extensive propaganda apparatus that was always looking for material demonstrating the moral bankruptcy of West Germany and Western imperialism generally, identified Müller as an asset. In 1966, two East German documentary filmmakers, Walter Heinowski and Gerhard Scheumann, flew to South Africa posing as a West German television crew. They found Müller, and they brought French Pernod, and they turned on the camera. The documentary that resulted is called Der lachende Mann, Bekenntnisse eines Mörders, The Laughing Man, Confessions of a Murderer. It is available on YouTube with English subtitles, and I would recommend watching it, because no summary of what Müller says and how he says it captures the quality of the thing itself. Müller, loosened by the Pernod, is relaxed and talkative in a way that the filmmakers clearly did not expect to achieve as easily as they did. He discusses his operations in the Congo with the casual affect of a man describing a hunt. He talks about what he saw and what he did with a laugh that never quite leaves his face, hence the title. He asserts that black Africans are no better than animals. He describes his ambition to enlist in the US Army and fight communism in Vietnam. He talks about being compelled to follow the barbaric customs of the Congo by not taking wounded opponents prisoner, laughs as he says it, and then, when the filmmakers press him on the specific meaning of what he has just said, attempts to walk it back. He is too drunk to walk it back convincingly. The filmmakers intercut his backpedaling with photographs from the Congo, Müller and his men posing with skulls, vehicles decorated with the bones of dead Simba fighters, the specific iconography of men who had decided that the heads and remains of their enemies were appropriate trophies. The documentary was used extensively in East Germany as propaganda demonstrating Western neo-colonialism and the persistence of Nazi ideology in the Federal Republic. In West Germany, the student movement that would produce the 1968 protests used Müller as one of its central symbols. Historian Quinn Slobodian has written that Müller provided a link between Nazi Germany and post-colonial conflict beyond polemical analogy, meaning that the connection was not just something left-wing propagandists were drawing for rhetorical effect, but something that was visible in the man's biography, his decorations, and his demeanour in the film. What happened to the German veterans who were in the Congo but who were not famous enough to be interviewed by East German documentary crews? Most of them returned to Southern Africa, South Africa, Rhodesia, or drifted back to Europe and disappeared into the specific anonymity of men whose adventuring years are over and whose stories are not interesting to anyone who was not there. Some stayed in Africa, some took the experience to other conflicts that were opening up in the continent as the 1960s continued. There was no shortage of work for men with military skills in a continent where colonial structures were dissolving and Cold War proxies were looking for fighters. The ones who went home to Germany went home to the same silence that Müller's story illustrates in reverse. They could not talk about what they had done because what they had done was not a story their country was ready to receive. The viewer who messaged me after the Vietnam video, the one whose relative had served in the Waffen-SS and then in the Congo, is the human face of this pattern, a family with a story they could not tell publicly, passed down internally, surfacing decades later in a message to a YouTube channel that had just covered the same general phenomenon in a different theatre of the same Cold War. I think there are many more of those families. The French Foreign Legion kept records, even if it kept them under false names. The Congo mercenary operations kept almost no records at all. The men who were there are largely gone now. What remains is the documentary record of the ones who became famous enough to be photographed and filmed, and the private stories in families that are still deciding whether to say anything, and the specific irony that a German veteran wearing a 1945 Iron Cross in a Congolese jungle helped defeat the most famous revolutionary of the 20th century on behalf of a CIA operation, and that almost none of the people who know the first two facts know the third. Siegfried Müller left the Congo and returned to South Africa. He worked various jobs in Johannesburg and its suburbs. He became, in the strange way of these things, a minor celebrity. Hated by the West German left as a symbol of colonial violence and unreconstructed Nazism, quietly admired in some South African and Rhodesian circles as a man who had done what needed doing without apology. He was interviewed multiple times over the years and maintained a consistent line. He had gone to the Congo to fight communism. He had done what the situation required. He had no regrets. The character of Captain Henlein in the 1968 film Dark of the Sun was based directly on him, a German mercenary in the Congo, Iron Cross visible, whose relationship to the violence around him is the moral centre of the film. He died in the Boksburg suburb of Johannesburg in April 1983 of stomach cancer. He was 62 years old. His obituary in the South African press noted his service in the Congo and his fame as a mercenary commander. It did not particularly note that he had been one of several German veterans who had carried their Second World War experience into a Cold War proxy conflict on behalf of a CIA operation that was at the same time being opposed by the man whose face would appear on 1 million posters in European student bedrooms in the years that followed. Mike Hoare outlived all of them. He died on February 2nd, 2020, in South Africa, aged 100. His memoir, Congo Mercenary, published in 1967, remains one of the primary sources for the 5 commando operations. He describes Müller in the book with the specific exasperation of a commander who understood that his force's effectiveness depended on not attracting the kind of attention that a man wearing a swastika medal in front of international journalists was guaranteed to attract. Müller was a public relations embarrassment for Hoare. He was also, whatever else he was, one of the soldiers Hoare described as among the toughest and bravest men it had ever been his honour to command. The Congo itself did not benefit from any of this. The Simba rebellion was suppressed by the end of 1965. Chombe was dismissed as Prime Minister by Kasavubu in October 1965, partly because his use of white mercenaries and Western military support had made him politically unacceptable to the Organisation of African Unity. Mobutu staged his second coup in November 1965, took personal control of the country, renamed it Zaire in 1971, and ran it as a personal kleptocracy for 32 years. The country, whose independence had been managed by the CYA in 1960, remained under the thumb of a CIA-backed dictator until 1997. The uranium that had built Hiroshima kept coming out of its mines. The cobalt kept going to jet engine manufacturers in the West and the Soviet Union. The people who had lived there through all of it, the independence, the secession, the rebellion, the mercenaries, the Belgian paratroopers, Che Guevara, the German veterans with their iron crosses, the whole Cold War circus, went on living there, under whatever the current regime happened to be. This is what the war produced in the men who survived it, a generation of soldiers scattered across the post-war world, looking for something to do with the only skill they had been given, answering advertisements in South African newspapers, clearing mines in the Sahara Desert, sailing ketches from France to Johannesburg to sign up for something they had not been told the full details of. The men this video has been about did not choose to be born in the year they were born, or to be shaped by the institutions that shaped them, or to find that when the war was over, the one thing they knew how to do was not wanted by the country that had asked them to learn it. What they chose was what to do with that situation. Some of them chose the Legion, some of them chose the Congo, some of them chose nothing in particular and lived quietly until they died. The viewer who messaged me knows his family's version of that choice. There are more of those families than the history has counted, and there are more of those stories than the history has recorded, and most of them will never be told because the men who lived them are gone and the families who carry them are still deciding whether anyone outside the household needs to know. That is what this video has been about. German veterans, a Cold War conflict, a CIA operation, a revolutionary who is now a poster on 1 million walls, and the specific strange logic by which a man who cleared German mines from the Sahara Desert ended up wearing his German medal in a Congolese jungle and dying quietly in a Johannesburg suburb at 62 of stomach cancer with no particular regrets. There is one more thing worth saying before this ends. The footage exists. The Laughing Man documentary is on YouTube, as mentioned. The photographs of Müller in the Congo are in newspaper archives. The Time magazine coverage from 1965 with the caption about Moises' black magic and the photograph of Müller in uniform is in the magazine's digital archive. These are not obscure documents, they are accessible to anyone who wants to find them. The reason Müller's story is not better known is not that the evidence is hidden. It is that the story does not fit comfortably into any of the narratives that the institutions managing collective memory prefer to tell. West Germany did not want to tell it because Müller was an embarrassment to the project of democratic rehabilitation. East Germany used it for propaganda, but was not interested in the complexity of the man beyond the symbol. The Congo itself moved from one crisis to the next, without producing the kind of stable documentation that historical memory requires. And the broader mercenary presence of the German veterans beyond Müller left no institutional record at all. The result is a story that lives in documentaries that most people have never heard of, in magazine archives that require specific searches to find, and in families like the one the viewer described. His great-grandfather's brother served in the Waffen-SS, survived the war, went to the Congo, came home, and the family has been sitting on that story ever since. There are more of those families, there are more of those stories, and the reason they matter is not that they are shameful secrets, but that they are part of the actual history of what the Second World War produced in the men who fought it, what it did to them after it was over, where it sent them, what they did when they got there, and what they brought back. Müller brought back a stomach cancer and a Johannesburg suburb, and a documentary that East German filmmakers made to embarrass West Germany that has ended up being the primary historical record of what he actually said about his own life. That is the specific kind of irony that happens when history is not managed and the camera is left running. The German veterans in the Congo, fewer documented than the French Foreign Legion, less famous than the Rajev or Kharkov veterans this channel has covered, but part of the same story. The story of what the war made and where what the war made ended up and how long it kept going after the official ending had been declared and the books had been written and the statues had been put up and the countries had agreed on what version of the past they were going to live with. It is still going, in some form, in the families. The viewer who messaged me is proof of that. He knows the story, he is not sure what to do with it. That is where most of these stories live, that is where they will stay until someone decides they are worth telling.